God damn it, punks! No sooner have we stopped, and I was looking forward to my sausage sandwich and breaking into the second half of my packet of long melter cigarettes, then Games Workshop go and drop another rules update about Warhammer the Old World. We've barely had anything in 4 years, and now 2 updates in the space of a week. So, before we go on to talk about this update that is all about movement, on which there is a great deal to say, I thought I'd show you something from here. Because you know what this is, don't you? Third Ed. And in the Third Ed rulebook, there's something very instructive here about formations, which I thought that I'd show you. Now, see what it says here? You'll see that here is a proper rank and flank Warhammer fantasy formation that is recommended that you use. And then there's another formation that looks rather like Age of Sigmar and a postmodern garbage dog's dinnery structurally mess of confusion. And it has the clear label under it, not allowed. So, that proves it, punks, that this is a proper rank and flank Warhammer fantasy game, and this Age of Sigmar nonsense can go hang itself. Now we've got that out of our system, let's have a little chat about these actual rules updates. So the first thing is that they talk about various kinds of formations. Close order, which is the same effectively as most of the conventional formations in Warhammer Fantasy. Skirmishers, ditto, we've seen that before. Open order and the lance formation. Now the last one of those, open order, is something rather new, which fights in a ranked up formation but has more in the way of manoeuvrability. Now, some clever folk have speculated that this is borrowed from Warhammer Ancients, and in that edition, this was used to simulate tribal fighters, or dudes who didn't fight in such disciplined close rank formations. They were faster, able to go over terrain more easily, but weren't able to claim as much of the rank bonus as closed order infantry. We might also speculate that perhaps close order infantry won't be able to be pushed back. Maybe they'll be able to claim steadfast. So there might be a couple of ways in which they can really differentiate these different kind of infantry formations. Now, if they wanted to go back into Third Ed that I just threw there on the floor, no disrespect, partner, they could also adopt some other formations, like the wedge formation, like the square formation, like the shield wall formation, or the testudo formation, which is a little bit like a kind of a Roman legion. So there are plenty of other ideas if they want to go down the formation route. And I have to say, I really like the fact that they're caring about formations, because I think that in 8th Ed in particular, the difference between, for example, infantry and cavalry and, the formations that they were in, apart from the Bretonian lance, all felt a little bit kind of bland, especially when infantry could spring long bomb charges on cavalry. But with these different formations, and some of the rules about some of the charging, which we'll mention in a minute, I think they're re-establishing the distinction between infantry and cavalry a bit more clearly. And to have some of these extra formations, which are taken much more with a historical kind of inspiration, I think is really a good thing, and it's one of the most promising things I think that I've read. That, in combination with having a pushback mechanic, might mean that we get something that feels a little bit more, dare I say it, realistic within this fantasy gaming system. So that is all really cool as far as I'm concerned. I like the idea that perhaps we might see a difference between really disciplined, slow-moving ranked-up infantry and maybe infantry that moves a bit faster. Maybe some of these dudes that are a bit like tribal fighters, they don't perhaps, say, have the same kind of discipline and can't claim some of the bonuses with ranks. Maybe they'll be able to hit the enemy more easily. Maybe they'll be able to dodge. Maybe individual warriors will have a simulated combat sort of ability where they're able to sort of express themselves a little bit more, and we might see that within the kind of realms of the game. I note a few other things as well, that units can't be deeper than they are wider. So that means the bus formation, which is the opposite of the horde, where you piled up ranks in order to claim steadfast for all eternity in 8th edition, might well be gone. I also note a very important detail in this announcement, which is that wheeling, on which we're going to have a little detailed look at in just a moment with actual models, is paid for out of the charge range of a unit. That might mean that it's a lot harder to charge than you might think, because in 8th edition you just measured closest to closest and the wheeling was free. Now you have to pay for it, and that, like paying for most things, is going to have some implications. Also, we may note that a very striking change is that infantry roll 2 dice to charge, picking the highest one. Now, the first point with that, fairly obviously, is it means random charges are in. That's not going to be something that everyone likes, but I'm not surprised about that, because I thought they were definitely going to have pre-measuring, and if you have pre-measuring, you're probably also going to have random charges as well. So, in 8th edition, infantry rolled 2 dice and added their movement. In this, they roll 2 dice and pick the highest one, and then add their movement. Now, while that would seem to make infantry quite a lot slower, if you actually look at the averages, I'm going to display a table on the screen that was sent to me by a very kind and statistically minded individual called Norbert Link, you will find that the average charge range of movement for infantry drops from 11 inches, which is a 7 on 2 dice adding their movement, to 9 inches, because the average roll, if you roll 2 dice and pick the highest one, is 5. So infantry have lost a couple of inches. Cavalry, meanwhile, and this would be if they simply roll 2 dice, or they roll 3 dice picking the highest 2, it's not clear which they mean, I think the latter is probably a bit more likely, are going to be quite a lot faster than infantry and be able to zone them, i.e. have it that the infantry can't charge them and they can charge the infantry. And we'll go on to explain a little bit more what that looks like on the table upstairs. So, there are, I think, some quite major changes here in the way that this all works. But overall, I must say I'm pleased. I like the attention to formations. I like the re-establishing of some of the speed between cavalry and infantry. I like this new marching formation that I haven't actually mentioned. That's where you go deeper than you are wider, and you can move at triple speed. You also might be able to wheel around a bit more easily as well, as I'll explain. And so we've got some really interesting different formations which express some of the varieties that we might expect to see in a historical gaming system. And we must remember that Warhammer Fantasy was of course inspired by historicals. In the 3rd ed rulebook there are many examples where they talk about, say, Roman legion, or they talk about pikemen, or they talk about historical kind of cavalry or Napoleonic soldiers or whatever it might be, because they were mindful that they were trying to adapt military kind of formations from military war games to a game of fantasy. And so to see that historical link re-established is really nice and really grounded. Right, let's go upstairs and have a look into some finer detail about what some of these rules might actually mean. Come on, let's go. Right, let's have a little hands-on look at some of the changes to these movement rules. And to go into these finer details, we've got 4 volunteer units. The first of them are these Chaos Warriors here, led by Lumpsucker. I'm assuming these are going to be close order infantry. Second, we've got some Knights of the Realm, they're led by Repants. Now I know Bretonians are allowed to use this new stroke old funky triangle dance formation, but I think I can demonstrate the points well enough with the traditional 5x2 cav formation. Then we've got Chantal the Prophetess and some Battle Pilgrims. Again, I'm assuming a close order infantry formation. And then finally, Jules the Jester and some skirmishing peasant bowmen. Oh yeah, there's a unicorn there as well. Not for any particularly good reason, but I just really like unicorns. My first point is all about zoning. Now, zoning is a simple strategy that fast troops can use to threaten slower troops. So Repants' Knights are able to have it, so they can charge Lumpsucker's Chaos Warriors in the next turn, but Lumpsucker's Chaos Warriors can't charge them. So if we imagine that this battlefield situation is from editions 1 to 7 of Warhammer Fantasy, the Chaos Warriors are successfully zoned by the Knights, because with their charge range of 8, they are not able to charge far enough to get to the Knights, whereas the Knights have a charge range of 16 inches and so are more than easily able to get to the Chaos Warriors, including indeed if the Chaos Warriors were to move backwards. Now, in 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy, all this rather changed in favour of the infantry, because now the infantry can go a maximum of 2d6 plus their movement, and so from a maximum of 8 inches, these Chaos Warriors suddenly can go a maximum of 16 inches and potentially get a long bomb charge on these Knights. Now the Knights still can zone them, but they're going to have it so that the Chaos Warriors are outside of the 16 inches, and in order to complete that charge in a 17, the Knights are going to have to roll a 9 on 3d6, picking the highest 2 and adding their movement, which is about a 50-50 chance. Let's see if they get it in this simulation. Well, it's an excellent example because you see they're 1 inch short. The Knights will only be able to charge 16 inches on this roll and thus wouldn't connect with the Chaos Warriors. Now, in this new version of the rules, the infantry roll 2d6 and pick the highest 1 and add their movement, whereas the Knights, it's still 3d6, rolling the highest 2. Now, that alters the dynamic very considerably from the 8th edition example we just showed there. Now, this will mean that the Knights can have it so that they can position themselves, and remember they are allowed to pre-measure this as well, 10.5 inches away from the Chaos Warriors. And so even if the Chaos Warriors were to roll a 6 on these dice, they would only be able to move forwards 10 inches and would not be able to charge the Knights. Whereas for the Knights, rolling 3d6, picking the highest 2, they would have to roll no less than a triple 1 to be able to fail that 11-inch charge. So this change to the rules, assuming nothing else applies, is very good for Repants and the Knights, and very bad for Lumpsucker and the infantry. Of course, we don't really know what other kind of benefits or advantages infantry are going to get, but superficially, this looks like Cavhammer, and it's good news if you're a knight. For our second exhibit, let's have a look at wheeling. Now, wheeling is a very important principle of movement. Rather than simply moving forwards, or sideways, or backwards, wheeling is where you hold one corner of the unit and move it like this, or like this. Now, the way wheeling is paid for, if we want to wheel Lumpsucker's Chaos Warriors to here, holding this corner, would be the distance between Lumpsucker and that purple dice. That's a wheel. Now, wheeling has the most important implications when it comes to charging, and especially how wheeling is paid for as part of a charge move, because that might determine whether a unit succeeds in its charge or does not. Now, let's assume that this battlefield situation we have here is from editions 1 to 7 of Warhammer Fantasy, where charges were doubled up. Now, if we simply move this Chaos Warrior unit straight forwards, they're about 8 inches away from the Knights, they will actually miss the Knights. And so what we have to do is wheel the unit. So at some intermediary point in the charge, the unit wheels, and then completes its charge, and then closes the door, which is another kind of wheel to the opposition unit. Now, wheeling was paid for traditionally as part of the charge action, although the actual closing the door part that I showed you at the end was free, for example in 6th edition. Now, in 8th edition, the dynamics of this were rather simplified, and probably simplified for the best, because measuring wheeling is quite complicated. Now, in 8th ed, it was just simply the nearest bit of your unit to the nearest part of the enemy unit. And as you can see, that's about 8 inches. So, in 8th edition, all Lumpsucker's Chaos Warriors have got to do is get an 8-inch charge, rolling 2 dice and adding their movement characteristic. And then they absolutely storm in on that occasion, whacking there into the Knights and surely sending them packing. Now, in this new game, the Chaos Warriors are, of course, charging 2 dice, picking the highest 1 plus their movement. Now, you may think there, closest to closest is 8 inches. That's a pretty gettable charge under those rules from the Chaos Warriors, because you're likely to roll at least 1 4 up on the 2 dice, and then you'll be in. However, they say explicitly on the announcement that that wheel during the charge, they don't say anything about closing the door, by the way, but that wheel during the charge at least is paid for out of the distance that you need to be able to charge. So that would have been an 8-inch charge in 8th edition. Now, with the wheeling included, is now approximately a 12-inch charge to be able to have to bring as many models as you can into combat and complete the wheel. So while my measurements there are not precise, you see the astronomical change that difference there in whether you pay for the wheeling as part of your charge or not has. It may make it much more difficult for units to be able to complete charges than it would have first appeared, because it is no longer closest to closest. I also really don't like having to pre-calculate wheeling, because it's very easy to just measure closest to closest, but with wheeling, technically speaking, if you think about the way in which you would measure sections, say, of a circle, that would actually be the distance moved would be on those lines. It would actually be quite complicated maybe to work out the theoretical distance that one regiment could charge to another. So I'm rather interested to see whether they keep that, because closest to closest and saying that you get one free wheel during your charge and closing the door is free seems to me to be a much simpler way of working out these charge distances, and both players being able to agree on exactly what a charging unit needs to get on the dice to be able to succeed. This makes it all a little bit more complicated and a bit more difficult to actually complete charges. My third point is about skirmishers. Now, these were rather loosely written in some previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, but got quite clarified in 8th ed. In 8th ed, skirmishers were like a regular formation in that they had flanks, a rear, and a front. They also had an arc of sight, which was the same as other kinds of troops. Now, if Jules and his archers were charged by these Chaos Warriors and weren't stupid enough to run away, what would happen is when they entered combat, they would all bunch together and go into a conventional 5x2 formation, ready to get their asses handed to them. Now, in this new game, it's all rather chaotic. Skirmishers are presented in their diagram as being an inch away from each other in a really rather loose and organic-looking formation. So, what I want to know about this, do these have flanks? Do they have a rear? What's their arc of sight like? If the Chaos Warriors charge them, what happens? Do they stay like that, or do they rank up into a more conventional formation? All seems rather unclear to me, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see for further clarifications. Our fourth and final exhibit is also about wheeling. So we've got Chantel and the Battle Pilgrims here in a 6x2 formation. So, in order for them to do a 90-degree wheel, that would cost them the same distance as their frontage, which is about 5 inches, which would enable them to move like this. Now, consider this marching column formation that we've been told about in the new rules. That will allow units to move at triple speed. Now let's imagine that Chantel and her Battle Pilgrims are arranged instead like this, from 6x2 to 2x6. Now, as well as being able to move at triple movement under these new rules, consider the implications for wheeling. Now, to complete that 90-degree wheel, 'tis a mere 2 inches to be able to do this. So I think that that's quite an important thing to be able to consider. Not only will these guys be able to move at triple speed instead of double speed, they'll also be able to take advantage of the inherent advantage of being able to wheel more in these longer snake-like formations, which might give these formations even more agility than may at first seem to be the case. Right, I hope you found that little example instructive and enjoyed seeing some of my toys in simulated speculative action. So, we've had quite a lot of rules updates now, and we're promised some more. And we may speculate, is this merely the end of the beginning? Or the beginning of the end? See you next time on the Dr. Blacksil channel. Bye bye.